Hello, everyone. We should be broadcasting now. Welcome to today's webinar, What the 2026 Congressional Map Means for Your Issues. My name is Anna, and I am the content strategist at Fiscal Note. And I just wanted to take care of a few quick housekeeping items. For those of you who don't know about Fiscal Note, we are your end-to-end policy intelligence partner. With our core products like Policy Note, you can track legislation and analyze regulation, as well as engage your stakeholders. But then we also have the trusted reporting of CQ and Roll Call with our award-winning journalists, many of whom are with us today, and as well as the grassroots power of Voter Voice, where you can run advocacy campaigns. To learn more about our suite of tools, visit fiscalnote.com to learn more. All right, I am going to turn it over now to our moderator, Jessica.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, What the 2026 Congressional Map Means for Your Issues. As Anna mentioned, my name is Jessica Werman. I am the managing editor for politics and leadership here at CQ Roll Call, which is owned by Fiscal Note. I am very excited to be joined today by a trio of experts, on this year's political landscape. Political reporters Daniela Altamari and Mary Ellen McIntyre, and Inside Elections editor and publisher Nathan L. Gonzalez. Even before last week, this year had all of the makings of a particularly newsy election year. It's the midterms. It's the first chance for voters nationally to weigh in on President Trump and the Republican Party 2.0. And we've got these razor thin margins in the House and Senate. We have also had a handful of states doing some mid-decade redistricting, throwing congressional maps into play in states like Texas, Virginia, and California. Then last week, the Supreme Court made it even more interesting when it weighed in 6-3 in its decision, Louisiana versus Calais. The decision made it harder to challenge gerrymandered districts that dilute the voting power of communities of color. Mary Ellen, we pretty quickly saw reactions from southern states to this decision. Can you give us sort of a play? I mean, give us like actually a broad brush because we could talk literally for the entire half hour about redistricting. So let's talk a little bit about what happened after this decision was made.
Yeah, I think, when everyone was sort of waiting on both sides of the aisle has been waiting for this decision. We knew it was coming before the end of the Supreme Court in June. It was sort of a question of the sooner it comes, the more likely it is that this could have some sort of impact on the 2026 elections and not just looking ahead to the 2028 elections. This sort of seems to be in a spot of timing wise, allowing some states to really rush through changes. We saw by the end of last week on Friday afternoon, Tennessee and Alabama both announcing they were going to have special sessions this week to sort of allow legislators to take different steps to revisit their maps. So the Tennessee House just earlier today has approved a new map that would eliminate Democrats' district, which is based in Memphis, held currently by Steve Cohen, give them Republicans a chance to go 9-0 in Tennessee. And then in Alabama, they are actually waiting on a different court case from the Supreme Court to lift an injunction on their current map, which does have two Democrats currently representing the state. And their special session is sort of focused on if the Supreme Court lifts that injunction, which they're pressing for them to do quickly after this ruling, delaying some of their House elections so that they can, revert back to an earlier drawn map that would only have one Democratic seat. And then Louisiana, at the heart of the Supreme Court ruling last week, has postponed their House elections. So early voting just started. They have their Senate primary, which is getting a lot of attention with Bill Cassidy up for re-election, taking place in about a week and a half, a week from Saturday. But the House races have been delayed there. And then sort of the question mark with all of this is legal challenges are coming quick to all of them. And so there is sort of a question of what are the courts going to decide? Are they going to let states sort of push through these changes and say, we're going to come back to the new maps later? Are they going to say, actually, let's keep holding elections? That's really in a wait and see kind of thing. We're not sure what's going to happen there. So there's a lot of questions, I think. And I think for a lot of people, probably a lot of confusion, especially in a place like Louisiana, where people are going to the polls, they're getting a ballot with their House primary on it. Do they vote? Do they not vote? If they vote, it's not going to be counted.
What congressional district do I live in, for the love
Yeah,
of
it's
God? Yeah.
definitely a confusing. I think it's confusing for everyone at
Mhm.
this point in time, as people need to, candidates have to figure out where they're running, states have to figure out what maps they're using, and people are going to eventually have to figure out who am I voting for.
Yeah, yeah. Is it mostly the southern states that are sort of pursuing this in the aftermath of this decision, or have you seen it
Yes and
elsewhere?
no. It's mostly southern states sort of initially responding, but you are seeing some Democratic-led states in other parts of the country, New York, Colorado. There's been some talk of Illinois responding because of how those states are set up, and a lot of them have independent redistricting commissions, which is part of the reason why they hadn't been able to try to redistrict earlier
Hmm.
this year, sort of in that first pre-Calais wave of redistricting.
Hmm.
So you are seeing them try to respond, but they're a little bit more hamstrung than some of these southern states that sort of are just calling special sessions and move charging straight ahead. There's not as many, some of those other states have more hoops to jump through.
So, Nathan, in the weeks before this big Supreme Court decision, the conventional wisdom was that Republicans have an uphill battle to keep the House. I mean, Donald Trump had sort of worked in a couple cases to influence redistricting, and then Democrats shot back in the Democratic states. I'm just curious as to, like, I mean, is there any way to sort of tell how this shakes out now? Do Democrats still have a little bit of an advantage going in despite all this? Or, I mean, how do you begin to even make heads or tails of it?
I think the narrative is still the same. Clearly, this is a fluid situation, as Mel laid out. But we're talking right now about Republicans kind of tinkering on the edges with getting, a seat or two, depending on the state. It would be a significant development if the Virginia map that Democrats pushed through, along with the help of voters in Virginia, if that was struck down, and that takes away, four opportunity districts for Democrats to take over seats there. That would be significant, but still, um, we shouldn't underestimate how unpopular President Trump is right now in this midterm election. Depending on your favorite polling average, he's at between 39 and 40% job approval rating. Republicans are in control of Congress at a time when there is wide dissatisfaction with the direction of the country, the state of the economy. When we look back for generations, that typically those midterm elections under those conditions don't go well for the president's party. And so we just, amidst all of the news that we're all trying to stay on top of, Democrats only need a net gain of 3 seats to get to the House. That's not a big number. There doesn't have to be a wave for Democrats to win. Let's say that all of this redistricting stuff ends up good news for Republicans, so then we're talking functionally Democrats needing a gain of 9, 10 seats. I mean, that is under, I think, the best case scenario, and that is not insurmountable under these conditions. And there was one election this week that didn't get a lot of attention, and that was a state Senate special election in Michigan. This was a race. This was the race to replace Kristen McDonald Rivet, who was elected to Congress from Michigan. And this was a district where Harris finished ahead of Trump by a point in 2024. In this
Hmm.
special election on Tuesday, the Democratic candidate won by 20 by 20. And this is just a continuation of the trend that we've seen for a year and a half now of Democrats overperforming in these races, performing in something closer to 2020. And under those conditions, the House is still within reach for Democrats.
So you've got this dynamic of this, but then you also have in Indiana this sort of the revenge tour of people who refused to, of state senators who got kicked out because they didn't support redistricting. So where do you, I mean, is the Trump power still strong? I mean, what this is the sway still strong despite the polling numbers, despite the war in Iran, despite affordability?
Think Indiana told us a lot about the state of the Republican Party, but didn't really tell us much about the general election and what could happen in November. It was remarkable, first of all, that these 8 state senators, at least the president's influence had diminished enough where they had felt empowered enough to say no, to, like, we're
Yeah.
not going to be on board with this redraw that the White House wanted. But what we learned this week is that among Republican primary voters, President Trump is still popular. He's still influential. He still kind of reigns supreme within the party, and there are consequences if you cross the president. So I think the story in Indiana this week was more about um, the Republican Party than the president, how he is with Democrats or independent voters, which is more important for the general.
So we called this, I mean, what this map means. I mean, this webinar is called "What This Map Means to Your Issues." So let's talk a little bit about the issues. And I say this with sort of the sort of facing the conundrum that, right now we're in May, and this is, these elections are not happening until we're having primaries now, but the big general elections are not happening until November. So with that little, with that note, what do you think the biggest issues that voters will be voting on this year? I mean, what at this moment in time, Iran, affordability, what are the big issues? Danielle, do you want to take this?
Sure. I mean, the issues are, depending on who you talk to, right? Republicans have their issues that they want to talk about, involving the bill that passed last summer. They want to talk about no tax on tips. They want to talk about tax cuts. They want to talk about immigration, which, despite some of the things we've seen, there continues to be, I think, maybe a little more room for them on that issue than on some of the others, like cost of living. Democrats want to talk about cost of living, corruption, and government ethics and things related to sort of how Trump is running the White House and the country, whether that's the ballroom or some of these other issues. Those are the things that they want to talk about. They want to talk about some of the extremes regarding immigration policy. So it's really, the issues depend on which party you're discussing.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that before I move in on?
I think ultimately things are really coming back to affordability. That was true in the November elections last year. We saw Democrats kind of on a wave of the spectrum from Zohran Mamdani to Abigail Spanberger focus on that issue. And I think that in the 6 months since, there's been a lot of other things happening. Obviously the year started with the attack on Venezuela. We have the war with Iran. But all of these things really do come back to affordability. It's just sort of been a change in sort of where the focus is. At the end of last year, there was a lot of focus on healthcare with the expiring Affordable Care Act subsidies. I was out in Virginia ahead of their redistricting referendum a few weeks ago, and I, was hearing a lot of candidates talk about the cost of fertilizer. I was sort of out in Central Virginia farm country, and that was really something that candidates in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, were harping on. So I do think that you're sort of seeing, as the campaign goes on, like where that focus is changes a little bit, but ultimately it's the economy that we're going to be coming back to, and people don't currently feel like the economy is in as great of shape as maybe they were hoping it would be under President Trump. We've seen his numbers on the economy maybe not be quite as strong as they have been in the past, which I think is a, notable data point that Democrats really point to.
It does feel like when it comes to pocketbooks, Nathan, that I mean, I know we talked about abortion as a big issue last cycle, and that didn't wind up being sort of the decider. So, I mean, is the economy really always sort of like your state, that your pocketbook is always sort of the thing at the end of the day that people vote on?
I think that's the default setting for our elections, the default setting, I think, in our own minds and in our own lives. There could be news events that happen that distract or put our focus elsewhere. But that's why, Mel and Danielle were talking about kind of it coming back to the economy, because even if there's a war, a war in Iran, but then it comes back right to that default setting, and that is where Democrats have their firm ground in these elections. If voters are focused on the economy, the current direction of the country, the status quo, that is going to mean a good election for Democrats. What Republicans want is for voters to focus on Democrats. If this election is a referendum on the Democratic Party, or do you like Democrats or not, Republicans are going to do well. They'll probably hold both chambers of Congress, but it's up to Republicans to change that conversation away from, I think, where voters are. And I know, I mean, Jess, you mentioned 6 months out from the election, and I
Yeah.
think sometimes it can be easy to say, oh, well, that's November's a long ways away. And on one hand, that's true, but I also don't want to use it as a crutch to say, but we can look at what is going on right now and where is the evidence pointing toward And that's right now it's pointing toward whether it's a good Democratic year or a great Democratic year, right? We're not arguing over whether it's a good Democratic year or a good Republican year. The conversation is mainly on one side of the spectrum right now. But we should, I know we should all be open-minded because things have happened in the past, but things are headed toward in one direction right now.
And this is not your first rodeo, so I feel like you are.
I know I have a
It's not
perfect
even your
record. I've
second
never been
rodeo.
wrong. I've never been
You've
wrong
never
on
been
anything.
wrong.
So,
Well, there you go. I mean, then why go to any other sort of source? Okay. Daniela, both parties have competitive primaries for for open seats and those with incumbents running. What are the dividing lines that we're seeing in Democratic and Republican contests? So, for example, you've got a Democratic race. What's it come down to? You got a Republican race. What's it come down to? Like age ideology for Democrat. I mean, tell me about what these primary races are being divided on.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Republican side, the primaries are pretty much being divided on whether you're with Trump or against Trump, or not even whether you're with him or against him, but whether you're perceived to be with him or against him. Because when you look at the big primaries, Mary Ellen referenced Louisiana, obviously a huge one. Senator Cassidy's in trouble because President Trump not just endorsed, actually, recruited a House member to run against him. Same thing, coming up in Kentucky with Representative Thomas Massey. He is a constant thorn in Trump's side, so Trump is backing a guy to run against him. So, even as you touched on Indiana, so that seems to be the key dividing line. Of course, there are others, but that's the main dividing line on the Republican side. Democratic side is really complicated. Yes, it's age. Yes, it's ideology. I mean, there are many of these contests are sort of encapsulate both of those issues where older incumbents are being challenged by younger, more progressive challengers, but not all of them. I mean, it's simplistic to boil down all these races to that. Some of it is just ambition. Somebody's been in a seat for a long time. There's a sort of backlog of ambitious folks, young or not even all that young, who are, sort of
The perception of young.
yeah, just kind of, chomping at the bit to run. And, somebody's been in office for a long time. It's like they just want them out because they want to have their chance. So, and some of these progressives, some of these older folks, I mean, you could argue the most progressive guy in the country is Bernie Sanders. How old is he? 80? Is he 80? I forget, but he's certainly up there. So it doesn't always break down as neatly as the conventional narrative would have it, but that is one thing I think that we're seeing this sort of these divisions between Democrats on age, on ideology, on some of these other issues, even gender, frankly. There's a lot of divides within the party. And that kind of goes to Nathan's point about some of the struggles that the Democrats are having apart from what's going on
It
overall.
is a big and fractured tent.
Yeah, it really is. And it can get messy. We've seen that.
Can you guys next, I hated that. I'm talking to you on a week when you're getting ready to make some very interesting decisions on what the most vulnerable Senate races, most vulnerable in the Senate, most vulnerable in the House. The House thing is it's complicated, as you mentioned, by redistricting. So I know the decisions are still being made, but can you give us a little bit of a preview as to what you see in terms of the big vulnerable members of Senate, the people who, and then maybe give us a little bit of taste of what's to come next week?
Yeah, the Senate map has been interesting this cycle. I think we started out doing this list a year ago, and it was a pretty short list because, a year ago the Senate map looked very small. There were, I don't have the full list in front of me, but a handful of races in sort of your traditional swing states, Georgia, North
Yeah.
Carolina, Michigan, New Hampshire, where like obviously there were going to be some competitive races.
Sure.
We are looking, as we always do, at incumbents. So, Michigan, we have a retiring senator. New Hampshire, we have a retiring senator. Those are off of the map. So it was a pretty short list. I think that as in the past year on the Senate side, Democrats have had very good recruitment for the most part. They've been able to get Sherrod Brown into the Ohio race, Roy Cooper into the North Carolina race, get strong candidates who they're able to put on, Mary Peltola in Alaska, to really put these races on the map. Now, they are still pretty tough races for Democrats. Alaska is a state that Trump carried by double digits. But Mary Peltola only lost her House race, which in Alaska is a statewide race, by 1 or 2 points last year. It was a pretty narrow race. She's well known. She's had huge fundraising since she got into the race at the beginning of the year. So they've been able to put some races on the map, which has sort of expanded the list in an interesting way on the Senate side. On the House side, there's an interesting mix of redistricting, has changed the game in some of these cases. And, in some cases, it's people who have been always vulnerable. I'm thinking, Don Davis in North Carolina, always a swing seat. He's no stranger to this list over the years he's been in Congress. But redistricting made his seat significantly harder. He was number one on our list the last time we did that, and that was really because of redistricting. We're still, I think some of these states where there's, really active litigation might not necessarily be on the list this time, just with some of the uncertainty around what are the maps going to be. But redistricting is certainly on that. This is the time of year also where we look at and have some actual data to consider as we put on these lists for incumbents who are facing primary challenges and are truly vulnerable to lose in their primary and lose re-election. So that is, something that we are looking at. And I think it's something we look at for every iteration of the list, but because of where we are in the primary cycle, we have polling data for some of these races. We actually can see, who's raising money, who is, forcing actually a competitive primary as opposed to, it's really hard to oust an incumbent in any kind of race, including a primary. So I think, 6 months ago, it was a little bit hard to tell. Okay, a lot of these people have gotten attention, but it's not necessarily clear, like, who is actually vulnerable versus like who is, getting a lot of news attention, but not necessarily running a legitimate campaign.
Yeah. Danielle, do you have any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, just to underscore what was said, for the Democrats, they went into this cycle on the Senate side with a really tough, grim sort of map of states that they had to defend. Just, by chance of the calendar, it was really rough with a lot of red states. And there's increasing enthusiasm among the Democrats, not just incumbents, but, in places like Iowa, which is an open seat, where they are, really hoping that they can sort of make some generational changes there and kind of get out of this difficult situation they've been in some of these states for, several cycles now. Obviously, Ohio, and as was said, the quality of the recruits they got, they are hoping that will make a difference. So it's kind of goes back to what you were saying. Things do change constantly, and the picture last November looks very different than the picture that we're looking at right now, and presumably by November it'll be a different picture as well.
Is there a race, a specific congressional race that each of you guys feels is kind of emblematic of where we are in 2026? I mean, of what this fight is all about for Congress?
I'm going to throw out of that the Michigan Senate race. The Democratic primary is in August, so we've got a few months of this primary that is really, I would say, in the last few weeks especially, but we've kind of known for a while is going to be a pretty intense Democratic primary. It's a three-way race, and you do have some of the sort of classic Democratic differences. You have Abdul El-Sayed sort of taking up the progressive lane, Congresswoman Haley Stevens in the moderate lane, State Senator Mallory McMorrow sort of in the middle of the two of them. Polls have shown this is a pretty tight race. It's getting a little, some elbows are being thrown. It's getting a little spicy. I think that's going to continue over the course of the summer. And this is not one of those Democratic races where you have questions of age. I mean, these are all roughly, in the same age range, all three candidates, which I think is also sort of an interesting dynamic of you don't necessarily have like the younger prodigy coming up and running against the tenured incumbent or anything like that. But Mike Rogers, who narrowly lost the Senate race in 2024 in Michigan, has consolidated Republican support. So he's sort of been able to step back, let the Dems go at each other. He's raising stronger money than he did 2 years ago, looking ahead to the general election. And like I said, it's an August primary, so it's late. You know, these Democrats are gonna um, have to spend on this primary. They're already spending, and yeah, we'll see. I think Michigan is one of those states. It's a Democratic held seat. If Democrats can't hold to this seat, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to have any prayer of flipping the Senate, which is, you know, a reach, looking maybe more plausible than it did 6 months ago, they'll say, but it's still a reach. But Michigan is going to be really, really crucial holding that seat to that goal. And I don't think this primary is necessarily helping them at this point.
I,
I wanted to pop in and just ask a few questions from some of the folks that are joining us today. First question we received is a question about Virginia and how much does the House control depend on Virginia? The comment was that Democrats seemed favored heading into the referendum, but now there's a question of whether the Virginia Supreme Court will strike down that referendum process. What's your read on where this is headed?
think it's hard to predict what the court will decide. I'm not in that business, but I mean, the current new map that was passed by voters would certainly boost Democratic chances of winning the House. But if it does get struck down, I don't think it's the sky is not falling for Democrats. There's still an opportunity to win the majority.
I think that if the map does get struck down, you know, the second district remains a very competitive House seat as under the current map. Democrats have also looked at the first district, which is a bit more of a reach. So they go from two pickup opportunities to four, which, you know, as Nathan was talking about, or from four to two. We're talking about such a small number of races realistically that are going to decide the House that it doesn't have a huge influence either way, I don't think.
Another question we have is about the five Indiana state Senate primaries. And I think the question is, are we over-interpreting the results from those primaries? Wanting to just meditate on whether or not just because Trump carried those states doesn't tell us how it might perform in November. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's just as Nathan said, you know, that's a red state. So Trump's influence is going to be magnified and much greater than it would be in battleground seats where, you know, the president does present some heavy baggage for folks who are trying to win over those purple districts. I mean, it's just going to be different. The calculus is different in a place like Indiana, I think, regarding Trump.
Last
It's pretty.
question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hold on. But it is pretty amazing that Indiana state Senate races are national, like the national
Yes.
networks and cable networks are covering them. I just did yesterday, I was on local WUSA 9 here in Washington, D.C., talking about the Indiana State Senate. I mean, this is not absurd. I mean, it's great for those of us who like elections, but like, wow, things have changed over the years.
We have time, I think, for one more question. Someone brought up any thoughts on Maine?
Do I have thoughts on Maine? Absolutely. Um, I think both. So Graham Plattner, now the presumptive Democratic nominee, and I think but you saw both him and Susan Collins put out ads this morning that I feel like are very reflective of their messages. This is going to be a huge race. It's going to be very, very expensive. I don't quite know how media markets work, but I have family in New Hampshire that I feel like are probably going to be seeing a lot of ads around these two. Graham Plattner is really saying enough of political performance from Susan Collins. And Susan Collins' ad this morning is saying, look at all this money that I got to bring back federal money for these projects and local projects. She's the appropriations chair. She's really focused on, you know, what she's been able to do over her 5 terms to bring back to Maine. And yeah, this one is going to be a lot of fireworks over the course of the year. I think those are probably like very clear introductory messages to me for what both of them want this campaign to argue on. And we shall see. It's going to be interesting.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who joined us today, and I want to thank our lovely panelists and our excellent moderator, Jessica. Thank you. Before we close out, I just wanted to let everyone know that we have a small one question survey at the end of the webinar. We just want to know how we did today. So if you don't mind hanging around, giving it an answer, that will really help us. And aside from that, I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of their afternoon and join us next time for our next Fiscal Note webinar coming up soon. Thank you, everyone.